Hey guys, tonight we begin with the wind howled across an empty plain, dragging whispers of battles long buried beneath the dust. Spears once gleamed under that same sun, now only silence carries their names. Before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you truly enjoy what I do here. Tell me, know in the comments where you're watching from and what time it is for you. It's always captivating to see who's joining us from around the world. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background. And let's gently into tonight's journey together. Before the world was mapped in ink and conquest, before flags carved borders into breathing earth, there were nations that lived by rhythm and story. Their kingdoms were woven through rivers and ridges, and their laws were sung through firelight. They did not call themselves tribes. That word came later, from strangers who mistook circles for weakness, who saw the open plain and believed it was empty. The story of the Native American warrior is not one of savagery, nor of noble myth. It is the story of men and women born in communion with the land, whose strength came not from iron, but from knowing which way the wind would bend before dawn. To fight was not to conquer, but to protect. To die was not to vanish, but to return to the soil that had raised them. Somewhere in the vast continent the Europeans called the New World, a Lakota child once pressed his ear to the ground and listened. For hooves, for thunder, for the heart of the earth itself. That was his first lesson in war, that every sound meant survival. That silence was a teacher sharper than any blade. The old world collided with the new in the early dawn of empire. Ships came, heavy with greed and scripture, and from their bellies spilled men armored in fear. They came carrying words like manifest and destiny, and behind those words, an empire waiting to devour. But long before the treaties, the trails, and the tears, there was pride. There were warriors whose names never made it to paper, whose bravery was sung on the wind and etched into the bones of their people. This is their story, not of loss, but of defiance that still hums in the dust, of forgotten lives that refused to vanish quietly. As the first dawn light touched the Great Plains, the world shimmered with motion. Herds of bison rolled like living storms. Smoke rose from lodges curling into the pale sky. Every movement, every gesture, whether it was part of a balance. To hunt, to dance, to fight, to die. Each carried the same sacred weight. To live well was to keep that circle unbroken. Warriors trained not in barracks, but beneath stars. Their weapons were humble, a bow, a lance, a painted shield, bearing the dreams of their ancestors. But their courage came from a deeper place, from story, from memory, from the belief that the spirit world walked beside them. In the morning of their youth, they learned silence before battle. In the quiet hours, before horses breathed and the first drum sounded, they would paint themselves. Red for blood, black for power, yellow for the sun's rebirth. Each color meant something, and every stroke was a prayer. These were not ornaments of vanity. They were promises, vows. Across the northern forests among the Ojibwe, warriors sought dreams before war. In the dream, a spirit would appear, perhaps a wolf, perhaps an eagle, to guide their fate. And when dawn came, they would follow that vision, believing the spirit had already chosen the shape of their courage. Farther south, among the Comanche, the warrior's code was unspoken but absolute: to protect one's people at all costs, to ride fast, strike hard, and vanish before the enemy's dust settled. Their horses were their shadows, their arrows extensions of will. They mastered the art of movement, be it of disappearing like ghosts, of fighting like storms. Yet what made them truly formidable was not their ferocity, but their restraint. The warrior was not a man of constant battle. He was a man who carried peace as his burden. Violence was never random, it was ritual. A response to violation, a song for balance restored. As white settlers pushed westward, the world of these warriors began to shrink. Not overnight, but like a river slowly strangled by dams. First came the missionaries, with their polite smiles and heavy crosses. Then the soldiers, with their polished boots and promises written in languages the wind refused to remember. Still, resistance burned quietly. It lived in the glint of obsidian blades, in the silent councils held beneath cedar trees, in the eyes of mothers who buried their dead and whispered to the stars, "Remember us." For the Native American warrior, death was not defeat. It was continuation. When an Apache fell, his brothers believed his spirit joined the wind. When a Cherokee died in battle, his name became song. These were not metaphors. They were the architecture of belief. They built a world where the past was alive, where ancestors walked beside the living, unseen but never gone. But the history books would not remember this. They would call them raiders, renegades, rebels. They would freeze them in photographs, proud faces staring through the bars of someone else's narrative. They would take the names, Crazy Horse, Geronimo, Tecumseh, and carve them into myth, stripping away the blood, the laughter, the smell of smoke on their hands. Yet even now, if you walk through the plains when the air is still and the stars are sharp, you might feel it. That pulse beneath your feet, the earth still remembers. The wind still hums the old songs, and in that hum lies the truth. They were never truly defeated. History, after all, is not written only by victors. Sometimes it is whispered by ghosts who refuse to fade. The fire crackles. The first story begins. The firelight dances, its glow flickering across a circle of faces, eyes reflecting embers, silence heavy with memory. Long before the word America was uttered, these fires burned as both hearth and council, where warriors learned that strength without wisdom was a danger to their own. The old men spoke softly, their voices weaving stories of ancestors who fought not for glory, but for the soul of the land itself. Every nation had its way of teaching the art of war. Among the Iroquois, a warrior was judged not by the number of enemies he killed, but by how well he upheld the great law of peace, a vision that bound 6 powerful nations under one covenant. Their strength was unity, their weapon diplomacy. War was a tool of last resort, a shadow to be invoked when balance failed. It was the wisdom of the Confederacy that later inspired even Benjamin Franklin, though history rarely admits it. Far to the west, the Hopi prepared for conflict with prayers, not swords. To them, war was a disruption of harmony, a sickness of the world that demanded healing. Yet even they carried warriors, those who guarded villages against raiders, who danced the Kachina rituals to restore balance after blood was spilled. For them, every act of violence demanded a ritual of return, an acknowledgement that even justice had a cost. The warrior in these worlds was not merely a soldier. He was historian, philosopher, and priest. His scars were not marks of triumph, but inscriptions, reminders of the cost of survival. When he rode, he carried not just weapons, but stories. Each battle, each loss, each brother buried beneath the horizon. There was an understanding, deep and quiet, that to fight was to carry ghosts. And every warrior knew that the spirits of the dead traveled close behind, whispering in the rustle of grass, warning against pride. Then came the foreign soldiers, their discipline like iron and their faith like fire. To them land was ownership. To the native nations land was identity. The clash was inevitable, not of weapons, but of worlds. Imagine the first meeting, a line of warriors, their faces painted, their eyes steady, facing men who called them heathens. the air thick with misunderstanding, with the arrogance of empire dressed as salvation. One side believed in dominion, the other in belonging. Both stood armed with faith, but only one would write the books. As decades passed, treaties became traps. The ink of every agreement dripped with deceit. The land grew smaller. The bison herds, once dark rivers of life across the plains, vanished under rifles and greed. And with every acre stolen, another warrior was born, not out of ambition, but out of necessity. Among the Lakota, young men who once hunted began to fight for survival. They became the protectors of a world collapsing. Each skirmish, each ambush was a message to the stars. We are still here. In 1866, at a cold Wyoming pass, a group of Lakota, Cheyenne, and Arapaho warriors led by a man named Red Cloud set a trap that would enter legend. 80 U.S. soldiers rode into an ambush they never left. The snow was crimson that day. History called it the Fetterman Massacre. The Lakota called it justice. Red Cloud called it war's necessity. Grim, inevitable, born from betrayal. But Red Cloud was no barbarian. He understood something the generals did not, that peace, to be real, had to be chosen by equals. When he later signed a treaty, he did so with clear eyes, knowing peace bought under deceit would not last. It didn't. Within a decade, gold was found in the Black Hills, sacred ground. The treaty was broken as easily as breath in winter. From that betrayal would rise another name, one that still burns like smoke: Crazy Horse. He was not a man of speeches, he was a man of visions. A warrior who believed he could not be killed by bullets, for the dream told him so. He painted lightning on his horse and refused all photographs, believing they would steal his soul. To his people, he was both mystery and myth, a spirit in flesh. To the U.S. Army, he was a nightmare that would not die. At the Battle of the Little Big Horn, he rode like the storm itself. Silent, swift, unrelenting. The soldiers called it Custer's last stand. To the Lakota, it was simply the earth reclaiming what was hers. But victory was fleeting. For every battle won, 10 more would follow. The empire was vast, relentless, and patient. It devoured not just bodies, but stories. When Crazy Horse was captured, they promised safety. Instead, they betrayed him, a bayonet under false peace. As he fell, his final words were whispered in Lakota: "We are not enemies." The irony would haunt the plains forever. The age of open warfare ended, but the spirit of resistance did not. It changed shape, became quiet, became memory. Mothers began telling stories by the fire, not of glory, but of endurance. Warriors were no longer on horseback, but within hearts that refused to forget. Even in defeat, their courage seeded something indestructible: identity. It lived in the rhythm of drums that colonial ears could not understand, in the defiant language of ceremonies banned by law, yet kept alive in secret. The warrior's fire never went out. It simply moved inward, into prayer, into silence, into dreams. And somewhere, across generations, a truth crystallized. To survive is the greatest act of war. The fire burns low now, its light steady. The wind carries faint drums across the dark. The story deepens from here, into faith, betrayal, and the ghosts that still ride the plains. Night stretches across the plains like a vast black ocean, and somewhere beneath it, the heartbeat of history still pulses. Steady, low, patient. The fires of the warrior age flicker in memory, but their glow is not gone. For every story of conquest written in English, there are 100 untold songs that whisper in Lakota, Navajo, Creek, Choctaw, and Cheyenne tongues. They carry the weight of memory, and memory, after all, is its own kind of rebellion. Before the world turned to rifles and iron horses, there was another kind of battle, the quiet one between belief and despair. When the land began to disappear beneath surveyors' chains, many warriors sought power in vision once more. They turned inward to the dream world, searching for answers the gunpowder world could not give. Among the northern plains, there rose a new kind of faith, not born in temples, but in dust and desperation. It was called the Ghost Dance. Wovoka, a Paiute mystic, spoke of a vision where the dead would return, the buffalo would thunder again, and the white man's world would vanish like smoke in rain. The dance spread like wildfire, across tribes, across languages, across despair. Warriors laid down rifles and lifted their hands to the sky, spinning in circles, believing the world could still be remade. To the US government, it looked like rebellion. To the native nations, it was resurrection. But the dream met its tragedy in the snow of Wounded Knee. It was December 1890. The air was knife cold, the kind of cold that burns the lungs. A band of Lakota had gathered near Wounded Knee Creek, weary, starving, hunted. They had come to surrender, or perhaps simply to rest. The soldiers surrounded them, nervous, young, fingers twitching on triggers. No one knows who fired first. Some say it was an accidental shot. Others say the soldiers had been waiting for an excuse. But when the first cracks split the silence, the world fell apart. In minutes, the snow turned red. Women, children, elders, bodies all caught in the frenzy of fear. The soldiers' rifles spoke louder than mercy that day. When it was over, the bodies were frozen where they fell, their faces toward the sky, as if still waiting for the spirits Wovoka had promised. The army called it a battle. History called it a massacre. The Lakota called it what it was, the death of the old world. But even in that frozen horror, the warrior spirit did not die. It simply moved into memory, into the blood of children, yet unborn. Because the warrior's strength was never in the weapon, but in the will to remember. Across the decades that followed, the United States built monuments to its victories: marble, iron, and arrogance. But for the native nations, memory was their monument. They carved it not in stone, but in song. They kept it alive in the cadence of storytelling, in the steady rhythm of drums that beat like hearts refusing to stop. As the new century dawned, the world of the native warrior transformed again. No longer could he ride with bow and spear. No longer could he defend the plains as before. But the warrior did not vanish. He adapted. He wore new uniforms, fought new wars, sometimes for the very government that had taken everything from him. The irony was bitter, but the choice was survival. In 1917, when the United States entered the Great War, hundreds of native men enlisted. Some were not even recognized as citizens, yet they went willingly. Perhaps it was duty, perhaps it was legacy, perhaps it was the echo of an ancient vow to protect one's people. Even when the world forgets your name. On the battlefields of France, Cherokee and Choctaw soldiers brought something no general could teach: courage, carved from generations of endurance. And when communication lines broke, a new form of warfare was born from an old language: the code talkers. Words once banned in schools now became weapons no enemy could decipher. The irony was almost sacred. The language once silenced saved lives. The warrior's tongue, after centuries of being outlawed, became the nation's shield. The Navajo carried this legacy into World War II. Their code was unbreakable, built from roots older than the nation itself. In the Pacific jungles, where radio waves tangled with chaos, Navajo voices carried calm precision. Enemy approaching, tanks ahead.
Simple words, but born of ancient syllables echoing ancestors.
The US called them heroes, and rightly so. But for the code talkers, the war was another circle. The same struggle for recognition, dignity, survival. They returned home to silence.
No parades.
No medals displayed. For decades, their contributions were classified, buried under the weight of secrecy and the quiet cruelty of indifference. Yet they did not rage. They simply lived as warriors always have, carrying the burden of history in their bones. Even now, in the 21st century, the warrior spirit lingers, not in battlefields, but in courtrooms, protests, and prayers. Young men and women stand at Standing Rock, their faces painted not for war, but for water. They chant not for blood, but for life.
Their shields are banners.
Their spears are words. Yet the echo is the same. We are still here. The circle never broke. For centuries, the empire believed it had erased them. But you cannot erase what was born from the earth itself. The land remembers its people. The rivers still whisper their names. Every gust of wind carries a story older than the nation that tried to bury it. And when night falls over the plains, you can still feel it. That hum beneath the soil, that heartbeat underfoot. It is the sound of endurance, the sound of defiance. It is the sound of warriors who never truly died. The fire burns low, but the night grows deep. In its shadows lie the forgotten gods and the faith that fueled every battle. The next step of our journey leads into that realm, where courage meets belief, and the spirit world walks beside men. Dawn creeps over the horizon, pale and uncertain, as though even the sun hesitates to touch a land soaked in memory. The plains stretch endless and silent, but beneath that quiet, stories breathe. Every gust of wind is an echo, every rustle of grass a whisper from the ancestors, the ones who stood when the world turned against them. By the end of the 19th century, the native warriors' world had been reshaped, not by surrender, but by survival. The great nations, Lakota, Apache, Cherokee, Creek, Crow, and countless others, had been driven to reservations, their horizons fenced, their movements measured. But to cage a people who had lived by the horizon was to misunderstand them entirely. The warrior's path had never been only about the open plain. It was a spirit, not a geography. Within those borders of exile, new kinds of battles began. Quiet wars against erasure. Children were taken to boarding schools with promises of civilization. Their hair was cut, their tongues forbidden. "Kill the Indian, save the man," the missionaries said, not realizing they were extinguishing light, not ignorance. The sound of drums was replaced by church bells. The rhythm of the old songs buried under hymns translated from Latin. But the warrior spirit did not die in those classrooms. It hid, behind eyes that refused to forget, behind the forbidden syllables whispered in dreams. Some boys carved secret symbols into dormitory wood, tiny tokens of language, prayers disguised as initials. Some girls wove forbidden stories into their embroidery. They were fighting, quietly, beautifully, waging the oldest war of all, memory against oblivion. In time, even the soldiers of empire began to vanish, replaced by bureaucrats and laws. Paper became the new weapon. Signatures replaced sabers, but the result was the same. Land lost, names changed, identity fractured. The treaties were rewritten, the promises buried, yet still the fire smoldered. In the early 20th century, while cities rose and modern America declared itself civilized, the surviving nations began to gather in secret councils again. The old warrior lodges became political rooms. The painted shields became petitions. A new generation understood that resistance could wear the face of diplomacy. They learned to speak the language of the colonizer, but they spoke it with the same iron of their ancestors' spears. Each word, each motion in court carried the defiance of centuries. And behind them, always, the elders whispered, "Never forget who you are." The world changed again after the wars. Native soldiers returned home to find their people still living under poverty and prejudice, their service forgotten, their land still stolen. But something had shifted. The warrior tradition, that unbroken thread, found a new shape. The veterans brought discipline and pride, and they passed it to their children not as a weapon, but as a way of standing tall. To fight now was to live with dignity in a world that refused to see it. By the 1960s, the warrior returned to the streets. He carried no bow, no rifle, only a voice sharpened by injustice. The American Indian movement rose from the ashes of forgotten treaties, declaring that the fight was not over. They occupied, they marched, they demanded the world look at the scars it had ignored. Their leader, Russell Means, once said, "We are not myths of the past, ruins in the jungle, or zoos. We are people, and we want to be respected, not to be victims of your guilt." At Wounded Knee, that same sacred ground where the blood of 1890 had frozen, they stood again in 1973, 2 generations apart, 2 battles on the same soil. The US government called it an uprising. The people called it remembrance. For 71 days they held the ground, surrounded by armed agents and headlines. But this time, the guns spoke differently. This time, the world was watching. When they finally left the siege, they carried something stronger than victory. They carried the knowledge that the warrior's heart had never been broken, only changed. Through the years, the warrior's identity shifted once more. Some became artists, painting the memories of the old days in colors that burned like blood and sky. Some became poets, turning pain into song. Some became lawyers, scholars, activists, wielding words like arrows, crafting legislation where once they had crafted spears. Every act of endurance was a continuation of that ancient vow to protect, to preserve, to remember. The fire burns in their descendants. Young men and women who still paint their faces for powwows, who still dance to the drumbeat that echoes through centuries. The rhythm is not nostalgia. It is continuity. The drumbeat is the heartbeat of the earth, the same one those first warriors heard when they pressed their ears to the soil. The land, despite everything, still remembers them. The rivers still murmur their names. The mountains, silent and old, have watched their rise, their fall, and their return. Even now, when the wind cuts across the plains, it carries the scent of sage, the faint hum of prayer, the ghost of horses running under endless sky. The forgotten lives of Native American warriors are not forgotten at all. They live in every protest banner raised for land and water, in every song sung in a language the world once tried to erase. They live in every heartbeat that refuses to bow. For the warrior, the fight was never about conquest. It was about connection to land, to ancestors, to truth. That connection cannot be conquered because it was never built on possession. It was built on belonging. As night returns, the stars shimmer like sparks from an ancient fire. They are the same stars those first warriors saw, the same light guiding new ones. Time folds here in the silence between drum beats, and you realize something quietly profound. The story never ended. It only waits for someone to listen. The fire cracks once more, low and steady, whispering its promise. The past is not gone. It breathes, it remembers, it watches. And as we step from this first act into the heart of the story, into conflict, irony, and the strange beauty of resistance, the wind rises again. The world had changed its weapons, but not its wars. Beneath the fragile peace of the 20th century, the old struggle remained. only now it wore a different mask. The warrior was no longer measured by his scars, but by how long he could endure the slow violence of forgetting. The great absurdity of history is that it celebrates those who conquered and mourns those who were conquered, yet seldom listens to either. In the case of the Native American warrior, history did worse. It rewrote him into a myth, a costume for school plays, a logo for football helmets, a hollowed-out memory packaged for nostalgia. The irony burned deep amidst people who once fought to preserve the earth, now reduced to mascots for a nation that paved over.
This is where our story turns darkly comic, because there's
nothing quite as tragic as the theatre of misunderstanding. When the last wars ended and the frontier officially closed, the United States declared victory. The textbook said the Indian problem was solved, as though a culture could be archived like an old map. Government officials handed out new surnames to entire families, English words meant to tame the tongue. Running Deer became John Rivers. Red Cloud became Thomas Gray. And with each new name, a small death occurred. One less word in the sacred lexicon of a people who had already lost too many. But the absurdity did not stop there. In the early 1900s, traveling Wild West shows turned history into spectacle. Crow and Lakota men, who had once fought for their nations, now played themselves on stage for pennies. They rode beneath circus lights, reenacting their defeats for the applause of strangers. Imagine the surrealism of it. Warriors of legend performing their own conquest as entertainment, while the audience cheered, ignorant and delighted. Some of those men carried pride into that humiliation. They turned the stage into a secret act of rebellion. "If they want us to play the savage," one Lakota rider once said, "then we will show them how savages ride." He spurred his horse so fiercely that even Buffalo Bill turned pale. The crowd roared. They thought it was performance. It wasn't. It was defiance. That defiance became the pulse of a generation that refused to vanish quietly. They learned to weaponize irony, to use the colonizers' fascination as camouflage. Anthropologists came to study them like museum relics, asking endless questions about primitive customs. The warriors smiled, answered politely, and left out the sacred truths. "You wish to know our ceremonies?" One elder said to a young researcher. "Then die first. We will tell you afterward." The empire laughed. The empire always laughs, until the laughter turns uneasy. The boarding schools, with their hymns and haircuts, thought they were producing civilized citizens. What they produced instead were philosophers. Boys and girls, forced to forget their language, began writing letters home in code, blending English with tribal syntax, until it became something new. They carried rebellion in syntax, dignity in silence. In one school in Pennsylvania, a boy named Little Hawk refused to cut his hair. They beat him, locked him in a cellar, and told him he was now Henry. When he was released, he went to the chapel and sang. But he sang in his native tongue, low and trembling. No one understood the words. They thought it was a hymn. It wasn't. It was a curse, not of vengeance, but of memory. He lived to be 89, and every grandchild he had learned his language from that same song. The curse worked. Elsewhere, the absurdities multiplied. Politicians declared that native people had been fully assimilated, even as they starved on reservations stripped of buffalo and crops. Photographers staged portraits, dressing elders in feathers they'd never worn, turning survivors into stereotypes for postcards. Each image sold a fantasy: the noble savage, the vanishing race, while the real people stood outside the frame selling beadwork to buy bread. Yet there was humor in that tragedy, dark and sharp, the kind that keeps you alive. When a missionary once asked a Hopi elder if he wished to go to heaven, the old man replied, "Is there corn there?" The missionary said no. The elder smiled. "Then I'll stay here." because even stripped of their land, their ceremonies, their names, they kept something the empire could never translate: balance. The warrior's philosophy will be adds that life and death are circles, not lines. That laughter is not denial, but endurance, and so they laughed. They mocked the absurdity of the conquerors who thought themselves civilized. They danced when it was forbidden. They painted their faces in secret. They buried their medicine bundles in the ground, where the government's boots could not find them. They outweighted history itself. The Bureau of Indian Affairs had its files. The museums had their exhibits. But beneath all that paper and glass, something ancient moved. Slow, deliberate, amused. A people who had watched mountains rise and fall would not be erased by bureaucracy. For every law written against them, they wrote another story. For every photograph staged, they told another truth.
And in every generation, one child, one woman,
one old man remembered the way the wind used to sing before dawn, and whispered it to the next. That whisper became a pulse again. The 20th century roared forward. Wars, presidents, skyscrapers, but in the corners of the continent, in the reservations and plains, the laughter of the old warriors lingered. It was the laughter of those who knew they had already outlived their conquerors in spirit. It was the sound of survival, dressed in irony. As the fire cracks and the smoke drifts upward, you can almost hear it. That echo of humor sharpened by pain.
of dignity wearing a grin, because sometimes
The only way to stay human in the face of absurdity is to laugh like the gods themselves are listening. The century rolled onward, its rhythm mechanical now. Trains slicing through the land that once sang with buffalo, engines roaring over soil still red with memory. The plains were quieter, but not empty. They watched, patient as always, and within the silence, something began to stir. A slow, simmering rebellion of identity. The absurdities of empire had become almost comic in their cruelty. By the 1920s, the government declared Native Americans citizens, a century after stripping them of everything citizenship was supposed to mean. They could vote now, theoretically, but most states found convenient ways to deny them that right. They were citizens only on paper, ghosts in their own homeland, recognized and erased in the same breath. A Lakota elder once said, "They gave us citizenship after they killed our nation." His tone was not bitter. It was weary amusement, the kind of humor one learns only after losing everything but pride. Meanwhile, the country that called itself modern was building monuments. Washington's marble, Jefferson's domes, while the people who had named the rivers and mountains slept in wooden shacks without heat. Still, the warrior spirit endured. The Great Depression came, but poverty was nothing new to those who had been living it for centuries. The difference was that now the rest of America finally noticed what hunger looked like. In those hard years, many native men joined the Civilian Conservation Corps. They built roads, fought forest fires, and restored parks, often on land that had once been theirs. There's a strange poetry in that. Warriors who once defended the land now repairing it under orders from the same government that stole it. But there was pride in that work too, because the land, even when confiscated, still spoke their language. Every tree planted, every river cleared, was an act of reclamation disguised as labor. The elders used to say, "Work is prayer if you remember why you do it." And so they prayed with shovels, with saws, with sweat. Then came the Second World War, and once again, native warriors answered the call. Some joined for adventure, some for food, some for loyalty, some simply because it was what their fathers had done. When the US Marines landed on the black sands of Iwo Jima, Navajo code talkers stood among them. Voices calm amid chaos, words flowing like wind between explosions. Enemy advancing, one would say in Navajo, hold position. Those phrases had once described hunts, ceremonies, creation myths. Now they guided artillery. There's a cruel beauty in that, at the oldest language in the land saving the youngest empire on Earth. When the war ended, America celebrated its heroes, but the code talkers were told to stay silent. Their mission was secret. They returned home to reservations that still had no electricity, no running water, and no jobs. The medals came decades too late, yet they did not demand recognition. As one Navajo veteran said, "The land knows." That's enough. That humility, that quiet power, was the warriors' inheritance. They had learned across centuries that the truest victories were not loud, but silence has its price. The post-war years brought new challenges. Relocation programs that promised opportunity, but delivered alienation. The government encouraged young natives to leave reservations for cities, to assimilate once and for all. Chicago, Denver, Los Angeles. Cities that swallowed them whole. In those concrete labyrinths, the old songs echoed faintly like drumbeats heard underwater. Yet the warrior adapts. That was always the way. In these new jungles of steel and neon, native men and women built communities from nothing. Apartments turned into cultural centers, basements transformed into dance halls where drums replaced jazz for a night. And somewhere between exhaustion and laughter, the absurd became sacred again. They told jokes to stay alive. They turned tragedy into irony, irony into strength. The Indian humor, sharp as obsidian, dark as smoke, became its own form of survival. "Why did the white man cross the road?" one elder asked during a powwow in Minneapolis. "To take both sides." Crowd erupted in laughter, not because it was cruel, but because it was true. And truth, when laughed at, loses its power to wound. Meanwhile, Hollywood took the warrior's image and twisted it into a myth that sold tickets. The stoic Indian, silent and noble, riding across sunsets that were painted, not real. Cowboys always won. Indians always fell dramatically, clutching their chests as if dying of narrative convenience. It was the same story retold again and again until the myth drowned out the memory. But the people remembered. Always they remembered. In small movie theaters across the reservations, children watched those westerns with wide eyes. Some cheered the cowboys because they were supposed to. Others, quietly, rooted for the men who looked like their grandfathers. Not because they were villains, but because they were still standing tall. One young boy in Montana years later would become a filmmaker. He'd say, "I watched those movies and I thought, they got it wrong. We're still here." His name was Chris Eyre. He would go on to make Smoke Signals, a story told by native voices about native lives, the first of its kind. A small rebellion wrapped in humor, the warrior's story retold through irony and tenderness. The battle had shifted from arrows to cameras, from open plains to screens, but the war for representation was the same. To tell your own story is the highest form of resistance. In those years, amid poverty, alcoholism, lost languages, and cultural theft, something remarkable began. A quiet renaissance. Writers, painters, dancers, descendants of those first warriors, began to rebuild their nations through art. The pen replaced the spear. The brush replaced the bow. And though the world called them modern artists, they were something older. They were keepers of memory, warriors of story. Because what is a warrior, if not one who fights to protect the soul of his people? And in every poem, every painting, every film that dared to say we are still here, the ancestors smiled through the smoke. The absurd had become sacred again. The forgotten had become visible. And the laughter that once echoed in defiance now rang like a drumbeat of rebirth. The fire flickers again, throwing long shadows against the walls of memory. The night is deep, but something stirs beyond it. Faith, old and wild, returning to reclaim its ground. Across the windswept plains and mountains, the 1960s came like thunder. The world was changing as civil rights marches, anti-war protests, youth revolutions, and beneath it all, the heartbeat of Native America began to quicken once more. The warrior's silence was breaking. It started with whispers. Elders speaking to young men and women about the treaties, about the promises broken, and the blood that paid for railroads and gold. Those whispers turned to meetings, meetings to marches, and marches to occupations. The old fight for survival had evolved into something new. The fight to be seen, to be heard, to be remembered as nations, not relics. The American Indian Movement, AIM, was born in Minneapolis in 1968. A small band of Native activists, fed up with police brutality and endless lies, decided to stand like their ancestors once had, with courage sharpened by desperation. They wore red bandanas, carried signs instead of spears, and walked into history with the same fire that once lit the Great Plains. One of them, Dennis Banks, said, "We are not free yet. We are fighting for the right to remain who we are." Those words, simple and fierce, became a war cry that echoed from city streets to sacred hills. AIM was not polite. It wasn't supposed to be. They stormed Bureau of Indian Affairs offices, occupied government buildings, and demanded to be heard in a nation that pretended they didn't exist. To some, they were radicals. To others, heroes. To the government, a problem to be contained. But to their own people, they were the grandchildren of Sitting Bull, Crazy Horse and Geronimo, not in name, but in spirit. Then, in 1969, came Alcatraz. For 19 months, Native activists occupied the abandoned island prison in San Francisco Bay. They claimed it under the same treaty, logic the US had used to steal their land. Unused federal land shall return to the
Indians. It was poetic justice, carved in irony.
They raised their flags on those cold stone walls, painted graffiti that read, "You are on Indian land," and sent press releases written with humor sharper than any blade. One read, "We will purchase Alcatraz for $24 in glass beads and red cloth." The same price. Of course, the Dutch had supposedly paid for Manhattan. History's revenge had never been so witty. There was music on the island, and laughter. Children playing between prison bars. Elders teaching languages long forbidden. Ceremonies held under the gaze of helicopters. The world watched in fascination, not because of the spectacle, but because of the spirit behind it. For the first time in generations, Native America was visible, alive, defiant. The ghosts were dancing again, and when the government finally forced them off, the fire did not die. It spread. By 1973, the flames reached Wounded Knee, the same ground where 83 years earlier, US soldiers had massacred hundreds of Lakota men, women, and children. Now AIM returned to that scarred place not to mourn, but to reclaim it. For 71 tense days, they stood against federal forces, surrounded and outgunned. Bullets flew again over that cursed ground. The air reeked of fear, of gunpowder, of prophecy fulfilled. A journalist asked one of the occupiers, "Why here? Why now?" He replied, "Because this is where they thought they ended us. We came back to show them they were wrong." The irony was biblical. The descendants of the slain standing on the same soil, armed with rifles, cameras, and conviction. The old spirits must have stirred in the grass, watching their children finish what they began. When the standoff ended, Wounded Knee was in ruins again. Burned homes, shattered hopes, empty stomachs. But something profound had changed. The world had seen them. The lie of the vanishing Indian had finally been shattered. The cost was heavy. Surveillance, arrests, COINTELPRO operations. Leaders were hounded, divided, sometimes even killed. The FBI's files on AIM grew thicker than the treaties it had ignored. But movements are not measured by victories alone. They are measured by echoes, and Aim's echo never stopped. Young people began learning their languages again. Powwows grew larger. Sacred dances returned. Old songs once whispered in shame were now sung under open skies. The warrior had survived another war. This one fought with microphones and memory instead of muskets. It's easy to romanticize rebellion, but rebellion is messy, exhausting, and often thankless. The leaders grew older, some broken, some bitter. The government promised reforms, but history has always been a patient thief. Still, something irreversible had happened. Pride had been reborn, and once pride takes root, it doesn't die quietly. In those years, native literature blossomed. N. Scott Momaday, Leslie Marmon Silko, Louise Erdrich, writers who turned myth and history into living art. Their words did what arrows never could. They pierced hearts. They wrote of broken treaties, lost love, sacred landscapes, and the strange, cruel comedy of surviving conquest. Momaday once wrote, "We are what we imagine. Our very existence consists in our imagination of ourselves." That was the new battlefield, imagination itself, the power to define your own story, after centuries of being written by someone else. As the century neared its end, the world seemed to turn again. Casinos rose where buffalo once roamed, highways cut through old burial grounds, and television offered versions of Indians so clean they might as well have been holograms. Yet under all the noise, the heartbeat continued, steady, patient, unstoppable. At powwows, the drums still thundered like distant storms. Warriors still danced, their regalia shimmering in the sun, each feather a prayer, each step a declaration. They danced not for tourists, not for spectacle, but for the ancestors who had kept the fire alive when the world tried to bury it in snow and silence. A Lakota grandmother once told a reporter, "They took our weapons, our lands, our children, but they never took our dance. That's why we're still here." It was true. The dance, like the story, was eternal. The rhythm outlived the rifles. The laughter outlived the laws. The language of the drum spoke of everything lost and everything found again. And somewhere in that rhythm, and between the bass of the drum and the whisper of the wind, the absurdity of history softened into something sacred once more. The warrior had never disappeared. He had simply changed weapons. Now his battle was for memory, his war cry was art, his armor was pride, and through the quiet rebellion of existing, he had already won. But beyond this new dawn, another question lingered. What happens when the past refuses to stay buried? When ghosts return not to haunt, but to teach? That is where our story turns next, into the realm of faith, prophecy, and fear. The American dream, that glittering mirage of progress, has always cast a long shadow. And in that shadow the warrior kept walking, neither defeated nor free, but enduring. By the late 20th century, Native America was caught in a paradox. The world wanted to celebrate heritage, but not history. It loved the feathers, the ceremonies, the stories, just not the truth that bled behind them. On television, the warrior became a mascot, a logo, a name for football teams and car models. Brave, chief, redskin. A history repackaged as decoration. The irony was not lost on those who carried real names. Sacred ones, spoken only in prayer. The image of the warrior had been consumed, polished, and sold back to the world as a brand. In cities, native people learned to move like ghosts among crowds, invisible unless someone wanted a photograph.
A man in Denver once said, they love us when we pretend.
They fear us when we're real. And maybe that was the cruelest truth of all. The world wanted the idea of Indians, not the living nations themselves. But beneath the noise, something deeper simmered. Across reservations, universities, and art collectives, young natives began peeling back the layers of myth, reclaiming what was stolen. One story, one word, one ceremony at a time. There was irony in their revival. The very tools once used to erase them, English, television, the internet, now became weapons of resurgence.
Online forums turned into digital firesides.
Young people learned Lakota or Ojibwe through language apps. YouTube channels began teaching songs once forbidden by federal law. The spirits had learned Wi-Fi and they were not amused, but they were patient. A new generation was rising, the descendants of warriors and code talkers, of marchers and mothers who had carried entire cultures in silence. They wore baseball caps instead of headdresses, tattoos instead of war paint, and they understood something profound. Survival itself was resistance. A rapper from the Navajo Nation once said in an interview, "Every beat is a heartbeat, every rhyme is a prayer. Our ancestors danced to drums, we danced to bass lines."
It's the same song, just louder. And he was right.
The music changed, but the rhythm never did. Meanwhile, the old wounds began to surface again, not as history, but as headlines. Reports of missing and murdered Indigenous women, children's graves discovered near boarding schools once called civilizing institutions. The truth, buried for a century, rose like smoke from a long smothered fire. It wasn't news to the elders. They had always known. But seeing the world finally confront it, seeing cameras pointed at their pain, was a strange kind of justice. Not healing, not closure, but the beginning of reckoning. And yet, even as sorrow thickened the air, laughter endured. That dark, unbreakable humor that had survived every war. At a memorial vigil in Saskatchewan, an old woman told a young reporter, "We don't cry to show weakness, we cry to water the stories." That sentence, so simple, carried the weight of centuries. Because the story, not the land, not the weapons, not even the blood, was the truest inheritance of the warrior. To remember was to exist, and to tell the story, even with trembling hands, was to strike back against erasure itself. In a museum in Washington, a display case holds a Lakota war shirt, hide stretched, beadwork still glimmering faintly under glass. A plaque says the warrior's name was lost. But what the plaque doesn't say is that somewhere a descendant still speaks his words. Somewhere his bloodline walks, writes, and breathes. The shirt may be caged, but the spirit is free. Everywhere you look now, the ghosts have returned. In novels, in films, in protests at oil pipelines, in ceremonies beneath skyscrapers. Their presence hums like wind through pine. They no longer need arrows or rifles. Their weapon is remembrance, and perhaps that's the deepest irony of all. The warrior's legacy was never conquest. It was endurance. His greatest victory was not over an enemy, but over time. A young historian once said, "We were supposed to vanish. Instead, we multiplied in memory." That is the essence of Native history. Survival as an act of defiance, memory as resurrection. The absurdity of their erasure has turned poetic. The names of tribes once marked for extinction now adorn schools, rivers, and songs. Children, once punished for speaking their languages, now graduate universities, teaching those same words to new generations. Everything that was meant to be forgotten has become immortal. Somewhere in the desert, a Hopi elder raises her hands to the sky at sunrise. The light spills across ancient stone carvings and the wind carries the smell of sage. She whispers the morning prayer, not for vengeance, not for victory, but for balance, because the warrior's greatest power was never in the taking of life, but in the preservation of it. To live well, to remember deeply, to forgive without forgetting. That was the true path of strength. In the end, the world that tried to bury them only gave them roots. And from those roots, entire nations grew back through the cracks of history. The story has come full circle, from the red dawns of the Great Plains to the blue glow of digital screens. The faces have changed, the weapons too. But the war remains the same, a struggle for dignity, memory, and the right to be more than a footnote. But the next chapter, the one written in faith, in fear, and in the unseen, lies just ahead, waiting beyond the candle's reach. Night fell over the plains like a blanket woven from smoke and memory. The stars, those old witnesses, shimmered above lands that had seen too much blood to ever forget. And yet beneath that eternal sky, prayers rose once more.
Low, rhythmic, ancient.
The kind of sound that doesn't ask to be heard. It simply exists like wind through pine or the slow heartbeat of the earth. This is where power, faith, and fear intertwine, because for Native America, faith was never a dogma. It was survival made sacred. It was the quiet knowledge that the land itself was alive, that the stones remembered, that rivers carried more than water, that every whisper of wind was a voice from the ancestors. In the beginning, there were no temples, no pulpits, no kings dressed as gods. There was only balance, the circle. Everything returned, nothing was wasted.
Life fed death, and death returned life.
Until the missionaries came, they arrived carrying Bibles and promises. They preached of salvation, of eternal life, of heaven beyond the clouds. But for the people who already believed the Creator lived in every leaf and raindrop, such a heaven felt strangely empty. "You tell us our spirits go to the sky," a Dakota elder once said, "but ours already live in the grass." Still, the missionaries persisted, armed with crosses and backed by soldiers. They burned sacred objects, cut hair, renamed children, and called it progress. They said the old gods were demons, that ceremonies were sins, that the drumbeat was the devil's echo. But you cannot unteach a song written into the bones of the earth. In boarding schools, children whispered those songs in the dark, under blankets that smelled of soap and fear. If caught, they were beaten, yet they kept whispering. Low, steady, defiant, a different kind of warfare. One boy wrote later in his diary, "At night, I sing in my head, so my tongue won't forget." That was faith. Not the kind found in sermons or scriptures, but in silence and survival. A belief carried secretly through generations, passed like an ember, hand to hand. When the priests looked at them, they saw heathens. When the government looked at them, they saw obstacles. But when they looked at the stars, they saw home. It is easy to think faith was erased. It wasn't. It hid. In stories told to children, in dances disguised as folk celebrations, in the way water was poured or smoke was lifted toward the dawn. Every ritual outlawed became a secret rebellion. Every prayer whispered became an act of resistance. Meanwhile, in the cities, faith began to take new forms. Some native veterans returned from war broken, haunted not just by what they had seen, but by what they had lost. Alcohol became their silence. Violence became their memory. But in those same broken men, faith also took strange new shape. Visions, dreams, hauntings. Many spoke of hearing drums where there were none, of seeing ancestors in the flicker of streetlights, of being followed by coyotes that vanished at dawn. Doctors called it trauma. Elders called it memory, because to them the line between the living and the dead was never meant to be a wall, only a veil. In one reservation in South Dakota, a returning soldier dreamed for weeks of a man in white paint standing in the distance. The figure never moved, only stared, until finally the soldier asked an elder what it meant. The old man nodded slowly and said, "He's waiting for you to remember your name." The soldier never drank again. Faith was not about worship. It was about connection. To forget the connection was to die even while breathing. And so the ceremonies returned, one by one. The sun dance, outlawed for half a century, began again in hidden valleys. Sweat lodges steamed under starlight. The ghost dance, that haunting, misunderstood ritual of resurrection, found new life not in prophecy but in healing. Its rhythm spoke not of war, but of remembrance. The government once feared it would summon rebellion. They were right, it did, but not the kind they imagined. It summoned a rebellion of the soul, a rebellion against forgetting. For generations, fear had been the weapon. Fear of the whip, the rifle, the prison, the priest. But faith, once reclaimed, became stronger than fear. When a people begin to remember who they are, no empire, no army, no century of silence can stop them. Yet even within the resurgence, faith carried its own shadows. Some began to blend Christianity with old traditions, a strange fusion of the cross and the circle, of hymns sung with drums, of Jesus walking beside the trickster. Purists called it corruption.
Elders called it adaptation.
But for those who lived it, it was simply survival wearing a new face. A Lakota priest once said, "We do not worship your God instead of ours. We worship him as part of the circle." That was the secret to their endurance. The ability to bend without breaking, to absorb without dissolving. Across the plains, church steeples rose beside sweat lodges. Crosses cast shadows over sacred stones. And in that uneasy coexistence, a new form of belief was born. Part ancient, part modern. Wholly alive. Faith had not been conquered. It had evolved. But power, faith's oldest twin, was never far behind. In every age, power follows belief. First to sanctify it, then to control it. And in Native history, the line between faith and power has always been drawn in blood. For centuries, white men used religion to justify conquest. But the same scriptures that blessed massacres also inspired resistance. Some Native activists quoted the Bible back to their oppressors, verses about justice, mercy, truth, turning their own weapons against them. One Mohawk man once told a preacher, "If your God made this world, then he made me too. Maybe he sent me to remind you of that." There was silence after that, the kind that lingers when truth lands too cleanly to be argued with. As the 20th century burned toward its close, the warriors of faith, medicine men, priests, poets, teachers, began to rise again. They spoke of balance, of peace, of returning to the circle. Their power was not in conquest, but in understanding. And yet, power, true power, always comes with fear. For every ceremony revived, there were those who feared what it meant. Governments worried about radical movements. Churches whispered about pagan resurgences. Even within Native communities, some feared returning to old ways might open doors that had been closed too long. But the spirits do not forget their children. They wait. And when the drum calls, they answer. The question was never whether the warriors would return. It was whether the world was ready for them. And as the candlelight flickers low, you can almost hear them. The old warriors walking through the grass again, not in anger, but in remembrance. The air trembles with something ancient and alive. Faith is not gone. Power is not gone. Only sleeping. And sleep, as history has taught us, is never permanent. The first snow of winter fell silently over Pine Ridge, soft as breath, pale as memory. It covered the earth like forgiveness, or perhaps like the attempt at it. Faith had survived, yes, but survival in its purest form is rarely peaceful. For the descendants of warriors, power was both inheritance and burden. To carry the spirit of resistance meant to also carry its ghosts. In the early 1980s, power became something measured again, in titles, in committees. in federal grants. Reservations were now governed by tribal councils, many caught in impossible contradictions. They were expected to preserve tradition while navigating the bureaucracies of a nation that still didn't quite believe they were nations. Power, once sacred, had become administrative. One elder joked bitterly, "We used to fight the cavalry, now we fight paperwork." It was meant as humor, but behind it lay a quiet grief. The knowledge that colonization had simply changed its form. No longer guns and treaties, but forms and signatures. Still conquest, just slower. The young warriors of this new era carried clipboards instead of spears, spoke fluent English, wore suits when they met senators. But their purpose hadn't changed. They were still defending the circle, still standing between their people and erasure. And in that strange balancing act between ancient and modern, something profound began to happen. They started reclaiming power, not through rebellion, but through restoration across North America. Sacred sites once fenced off or desecrated were being protected again. Eagle feathers returned to ceremonies. Children began learning dances that hadn't been seen in 2 generations. And the elders, who had lived long enough to see both destruction and rebirth, watched with eyes bright as dawn. One such elder, a woman named Agnes White from Oklahoma, was asked by a journalist what she thought of all the cultural revival. She smiled,
shook her head, and said, "We're not reviving it.
It never died. We just stopped whispering." Her words held the truth of centuries. Power is not always taken. Sometimes it's remembered. But the old fear lingered still. Fear of losing what little had been regained. Fear that the same cycle would repeat again as it always had. Fear, after all, is a kind of inheritance too. The reservations, once prisons of poverty and despair, became paradoxes. They were at once home and exile, sacred ground and cage. Young people spoke of leaving to find themselves, only to realize that everything they sought was buried in the soil they'd fled. Faith called them home, even when the world pulled them away. Meanwhile, the outside world turned its gaze upon Native America once more. But now, it was fashionable.
Spiritual tourism, they called it.
Workshops on native wisdom. Corporate retreats featuring sacred smudging experiences. White seekers paid hundreds of dollars to learn ceremonies their ancestors had once outlawed. It was absurd, yes, but also tragic. Because while the commodified versions spread like wildfire, the real knowledge still lived quietly in the elders' hands, guarded like flame in wind. A medicine man from New Mexico once told a visitor, "Do you want to use our prayers for healing? But prayers are not recipes. They only work if the land knows your name." The visitor didn't understand.
Most never did. Power for the warrior was never about control.
It was about relationship, a covenant between people in the living world. To break that covenant was to invite imbalance. And in the late 20th century, imbalance was everywhere. Poisoned rivers, vanishing species, melting ice. The earth itself began to echo what native prophets had warned for generations. "Someday," said the Hopi, "the earth will shake to remind you that you forgot her." And it did. Storms grew stronger. Fires burned longer. The circle was breaking again, not just for one people, but for all. Suddenly the wisdom once dismissed as primitive began to sound prophetic. Scientists spoke of sustainability. Economists spoke of harmony. Words the elders had spoken all along. Words that needed no translation, only humility. And yet, within native communities, fear continued its whisper. Not of outsiders now, but of forgetting from within. The pull of modern life was powerful. The internet, the cities, the endless noise of progress, all of it threatened to drown the old rhythms. The drums grew quieter, the stories shorter, the ceremonies rarer. Faith, like any fire, must be fed. But the warriors of this generation fought differently. They built schools that taught both algebra and ancestral songs. They live-streamed powwows. They tattooed old symbols on new skin. They blended the sacred with the digital, turning survival itself into art. A young Lakota woman once said in an interview, "My grandmother prayed in the dark because they told her it was illegal. I pray on Instagram so the world can't say it never happened." It was defiance.
Wrapped in humor, pulsing with truth, power had evolved again, now measured in visibility.
In narrative, in the ability to speak without permission, faith had found new forms and fear had begun to shrink in their light. Still, the old stories warned of one final enemy, the most dangerous kind: forgetting why you fought. The warrior who no longer remembers his cause becomes his own conqueror. And in the age of screens and speed, that danger loomed like a shadow on the horizon. Elders said the circle was not complete yet, that there was still one trial to face. Not a war of weapons, not of governments, but of spirit. It would come quietly, they said, through comfort, through distraction, through the illusion of peace. The warrior's greatest challenge was not survival anymore. It was meaning. "Do not mistake breathing for living," one old chief said before he died. Our people are still alive. But are we awake? The words lingered like smoke, unanswered. Outside, the snow began to fall harder, covering footprints, swallowing roads. The world seemed still, deceptively still. Somewhere in that white silence, the wind carried a whisper, not of fear, but of warning. Because every time the world forgets balance, the land remembers. And when it remembers, it calls the warriors again. This time, not to fight with arrows or words, but to remind humanity what faith truly means: to belong, not to rule, to listen, not to own, and somewhere beyond the horizon, in the deep quiet of snow and night, that call has already begun. The wind across the plains can sound like a voice if you listen long enough. Ancient, low, and restless. It speaks not in words, but in echoes. The ancestors once called that sound the remembering, the moment when the earth itself recalls what was done upon it. In that wind, you can hear everything: the prayers of the living, the cries of the dead, the drumbeats of faith, and the soft shuffle of power changing hands again. Because history, for Native America, has never been a straight line. It is a spiral, turning and returning, each revolution bringing old truths to new light. And now, at the turn of the millennium, that spiral began to tighten. The world was globalizing, nations trading, cultures merging, the internet stitching together lives from every corner. For Native peoples, it was both blessing and danger. Visibility brought power, but also exposure. The sacred became content. Ceremonies streamed for clicks. Dances turned into hashtags. The ancient was made trendy, and the spiritual became an aesthetic. But somewhere beneath that noise, a deeper current ran. A quiet, spiritual uprising. A refusal to let sacredness become spectacle. Among the Lakota, young medicine men began reviving the Uwipi ceremonies. Nights spent in total darkness, singing for healing. Among the Dene, sand painting returned as ritual rather than museum art. And in the Pacific Northwest, potlatches, once banned by colonial law, came roaring back with drumming so loud it seemed to shake the sea itself. Faith was not dead, it was remembering itself. And yet, the darker side of faith, fear, remained close behind. Fear of betrayal, of corruption, of spiritual theft. The new age of curiosity brought seekers from far beyond the reservations. People hungry for meaning, for belonging, for redemption. But many came not to listen but to consume. They took bits and pieces of ceremonies like souvenirs. Burning sage in luxury apartments, calling themselves shamans after weekend retreats. The elders called them plastic medicine men, imitation healers, selling the sacred for profit. A Lakota spiritual leader once said, "If you sell a prayer, it stops being a prayer." Those words cut like thunder through the illusion of enlightenment. And so, the people withdrew again, not out of bitterness, but out of protection. Faith, they said, is like a flame. If too many hands reach for it, it burns out. Meanwhile, power found new shapes in politics. Native leaders began to rise in government, in law, in education. Warriors in suits now wielding words sharper than any weapon. They spoke of sovereignty, of environmental justice, of treaties still waiting to be honored. For the first time in centuries, the warriors stood not outside the system but within it. And yet, even there, fear followed. Because power gained within another's house is never truly safe. The walls still remember who built them. But in that uneasy balance, a transformation began. Power no longer meant domination. It meant endurance, advocacy, protection. Faith no longer belonged solely to the elders. It became a shared inheritance, reshaped by every generation that refused to forget. And fear, that old ghost, began to lose its teeth. In the deserts of Arizona, a group of young women revived the traditional coming-of-age ceremonies that had been banned a century before. They danced for days in heat that shimmered like glass, their faces painted with red earth, their voices carrying across canyons. Tourists watched from a distance, taking photos. But for those within the circle, it was not performance. It was rebirth. One dancer, exhausted and smiling, said afterward, "I don't know what our ancestors called it, but I think we just prayed ourselves back into existence." There was laughter, and there were tears, and there was the sound of drums echoing against stone. Faith had found its fire again. Elsewhere, new kinds of warriors were rising. Water protectors, language teachers, climate activists. They stood at rivers and pipelines, not with rifles, but with songs. At Standing Rock, the Missouri River became both battlefield and altar. The people called themselves defenders, and when police surrounded them with tear gas and rifles, they knelt and prayed. It was not weakness. It was weaponry of a different kind. A young woman from the camp told a reporter, "We are not here to fight. We are here to remember that the earth is alive." That sentence, so soft, so human, terrified those in power. Because when faith and courage combine, fear becomes useless. The old warriors had returned in new forms, tattooed, educated, connected by the web, but rooted in the land. They carried cell phones and sacred bundles in the same hands. They prayed in English and Lakota, sometimes in both at once. They wrote poetry that felt like prophecy. They were modern and ancient all at once, and for the first time in centuries, their faith began to ripple outward again, influencing not just native communities, but the world. Climate activists quoted their wisdom. Scientists began studying indigenous land management practices. The same ideas once dismissed as superstition were now called sustainability. The circle had turned once more, but even as the world began to listen, the people knew this was not the end, because the warrior's path has no end, only continuation. Faith without vigilance fades. Power without humility corrupts. And fear, though wounded, waits in silence for the next generation to forget. The elders warned, the land does not need us to survive. We need her. If we stop listening, she will remind us. And the reminders came in floods, in fires, in winds that tore down cities like paper. Each disaster whispered the same truth the ancestors had spoken for millennia. All power is borrowed. All life is shared. All forgetting is punished. Yet amid the chaos, something extraordinary emerged. a quiet understanding that humanity had begun to relearn what native nations had never forgotten, that faith is not belief in something unseen, but gratitude for what is alive, that power is not control but care, and that fear is not the enemy, only the reminder of how much there is to lose. Somewhere in the stillness after a storm, a Lakota singer raised his voice to the sky. He sang an old warrior song, slow, defiant, beautiful. The same song his ancestors had sung before battle, before death, before dawn.
Only now it wasn't for war.
It was for the future. The wind carried it far into cross cities, highways,
Oceans, until it sounded less like lament and more like promise. Because even as faith trembled and fear lingered, the warrior spirit did what it always had.
It endured, it remembered, it waited, and soon it would speak again, not as a whisper, but as a reckoning. When night falls over the plains, silence is never truly silent. There's the slow crackle of cooling earth, the distant coyote cry, and the faint hiss of wind weaving through grass. These sounds are older than memory. They are the breath of the land itself. For the warriors of the old nations, that sound meant safety. It meant the spirits were listening. In the final years of the 20th century and into the early 21st, many believed those voices had faded. The noise of modern life, engines, screens, sirens, drowned them out. But for those who still knew how to listen, the spirits never stopped speaking. They only grew quieter, waiting for the right ears. The new generation of native warriors was learning to hear again, not through the rituals of war, but through the language of survival. They called themselves by many names: veterans, protectors, singers, storytellers, scholars. Yet the spirit that bound them was one and the same. Each fought for something larger than self. In the Pacific forests, tribes fought legal battles for the return of ancestral lands. In the Arctic, Inuit hunters documented the shifting ice to prove the climate's betrayal. On the reservations, young men and women taught endangered languages to children who had been raised with none. These acts, quiet, unseen by most, were battles every bit as real as those fought with steel. It was no longer about spears or rifles. It was about stories. Whoever controls the story controls the memory, and whoever controls the memory controls the future. That truth wasn't new. It had been written in the songs of every nation since the beginning. The Lakota Wingyan Luta sang of women whose voices could shatter lies. The Cherokee told of a fire that only truth could keep burning. The Hopi said the world itself was born from a story told by the stars. And so the warriors began to write again. Novels, documentaries, films, poetry, all weapons of remembering. One poet from the Dine Nation wrote, "They tried to erase us, but they forgot the wind has no address." That line became a rallying cry across campuses and art galleries. The poetry of survival had become a new form of warfare, not against nations, but against forgetting. Yet every resurgence comes with a shadow. For every word that honored the past, there was a world eager to commercialize it. Hollywood borrowed imagery it never earned. Dream catchers, drums, feathers, symbols stripped of meaning and sold as decoration. The same system that once outlawed native faith now profited from its imitation, but the people saw through it. They always had. A Mohawk artist named Owenha spoke at a gallery opening in New York. Surrounded by sleek marble walls and white wine, she said softly, "If they sell your story, tell it louder." Then she turned, unveiled her painting, a warrior in full regalia staring directly at the viewer. And beneath it, in red paint, were the words, "We are still here." The crowd fell silent. The city's heartbeat seemed to pause, and in that moment, every stolen story, every silenced prayer, seemed to breathe again. The modern warrior's faith was not confined to gods or temples anymore. It was faith in endurance, faith that ancestors walk beside the living, faith that the earth remembers names long after stone forgets. It was not religion. It was relationship. And power, once measured in conquests and titles, was now measured in care. Who tended the land, who taught the children, who carried the songs. In a small Montana classroom, an elder named Thomas taught Lakota words to teenagers who had never heard them spoken by their parents. When asked why it mattered, he smiled and said, "Because language is how the soul recognizes itself." That sentence, as simple as it was, carried the weight of centuries. Outside that classroom, America still debated what it owed its first peoples. There were apologies, land acknowledgements, museum restitutions, gestures noble on the surface, but hollow when unaccompanied by change. Still, each acknowledgement was a crack in the armor of denial, a small step towards something like justice. At night, across the reservations, fires still burned. Ceremonies still rose into the dark. The smell of sage drifted into the stars. Some prayed in English, others in languages older than empire, but the message was always the same. Remember us. Remember who we are. And the world, slowly, began to listen. By the dawn of the 2020s, native warriors were no longer only in the margins of textbooks or folklore. They were authors, actors, senators, scientists. Some wore traditional beadwork, others wore business suits. All carried the same fire. The fight had changed, but the heartbeat had not, because the warrior's strength was never in killing. It was in keeping stories, keeping land, keeping love alive when the world tried to erase it. One night at Standing Rock, as the campfires died down and the drums faded into silence, an old veteran, grey-haired, face weathered like stone, looked at the horizon and said, "My grandfather fought with arrows. My father fought with rifles. I fought with words. Maybe my grandchildren will fight with none." Then he smiled. A slow, tired, beautiful smile. Maybe they'll just live. The sky above him was wide and black, filled with stars that had watched this land since before it had a name. The river whispered, the wind sighed, and somewhere far off, a coyote called to the dark. In that sound, the blending of life and loss, there was the story of every warrior who had ever lived, and everyone still to come, because faith, power, and fear were never separate things. They were a trinity, a storm, forever shaping one another. The warrior learns to walk through all three and not lose himself, to fight without hatred, to believe without blindness, to fear and yet move forward. And that is what the modern warrior had become, not the destroyer of enemies, but the protector of memory. As the last campfire flickered, the elder whispered into the smoke, "We are still here." The flame trembled once, as if bowing in acknowledgement. Then it went out, not in defeat, but in peace, for even in darkness the wind still carries the song.
At dawn, the world feels unfinished.
Mist drifts low across the plains like memory taking form, and the first light of the sun spills over the horizon, painting the earth in gold and ghostly white. It is the kind of morning that belongs to silence. The sacred pause between what was and what will be. In that silence, the land remembers. Every hill, every river, every broken stone holds a story. But for too long, those stories were buried beneath the noise of conquest, beneath iron and asphalt, beneath the polite lies of history books that forgot to listen. And yet somehow the stories endured. They waited, as they always do, for someone to speak them again. Now, after centuries of erasure, the remembering has begun across the continent. Museums have started to return what was stolen, regalia, sacred bundles, the bones of ancestors once displayed behind glass. The process is slow, awkward, and incomplete. But for the families who receive them, it is everything. When the first remains are reburied, the songs return to the earth like rain. People weep, not just for loss, but for the closing of a wound that never healed. In one such ceremony in South Dakota, a young woman held the skull of her great-great-grandfather. She had never known his name until that day. As the drum beats rose, she whispered through tears, "Welcome home." Then the wind changed, soft and warm, as if the land itself exhaled. These moments, small, fragile, are what healing looks like.
Not victory, not justice.
But balance, finally trying to restore itself. Because the story of Native American warriors was never about war.
It was about survival.
And survival, in its purest form, is not just the refusal to die. 'Tis the insistence on living well, to laugh, to love, to teach, to keep the circle unbroken. In the present day, that circle has widened. The songs once confined to the plains now echo in cities. Powwows light up stadiums. Elders livestream storytelling sessions to children across the world. What was once hidden in shadow now shines beneath the digital sun. The old dances are still danced, but the drums share space with laptops and neon lights. And yet, the essence remains untouched. When the drum begins, when the first voice rises, something ancient stirs. You can feel it in your chest before you understand it. It is the same heartbeat that once guided warriors across endless plains, the same rhythm that carried prayers through the smoke of burning villages, the same pulse that says, even now we are still here, but survival alone is not enough. The new warriors know this. A fight for more than endurance. A fight for the right to flourish, to control their own stories, to define beauty, power, and pride without asking permission. In Montana, a native filmmaker creates a movie in her grandmother's language, a language that nearly vanished a generation ago. In Oklahoma, a young boy recites the words of a traditional warrior song on TikTok, reaching millions. In Washington, tribal leaders negotiate new treaties for clean water rights, reminding the government that sovereignty was never a gift, but a birthright. These are not isolated acts. They are strands in a larger web, glimmering beneath the light of renewal. Meanwhile, across universities, scholars of native descent teach the next generation the truths their textbooks once hid. That democracy itself learned from the Haudenosaunee Confederacy, that ecological wisdom was first written in oral stories. That civilization did not begin with cities, but with the land. Every lecture, every word, every act of truth-telling is a weapon against forgetting. Still the shadows linger. Poverty remains. Addiction, displacement, the quiet ache of historical trauma. These ghosts do not vanish simply because the world has begun to listen. Healing, like memory, is a slow fire. It burns inward before it shines outward. And for many, the hardest battle is fought in silence. One veteran, a Lakota man who served in Afghanistan, returned home only to find himself a stranger on his own reservation.
"I fought for a country that doesn't remember me," he said.
Then after a pause, he added, "But the land does." That was enough to keep him going. The land, that constant, unflinching witness, remembers all who have walked it. It does not judge.
It does not forget.
It simply waits, and maybe that is where all healing begins. In remembering that we are part of something older than every border, every flag, every empire. That before steel and gunpowder and greed, there was wind and grass and fire and the hum of a drum. For native warriors, remembrance is not nostalgia. It is resistance. To remember is to reject extinction. To sing the old songs is to defy silence. To stand on sacred ground is to remind the world that conquest is never complete, and so,
every time a powwow begins, every time a child learns their first word in the tongue of their ancestors,
every time the land is treated not as property but as kin, the old warriors breathe again. You can almost see them. In the smoke, in the wind, in the faces of the young who carry their fire forward. The circle is still unbroken, and though it has bent beneath the weight of centuries, it has never shattered. Because for every warrior buried, another rises. Not from vengeance, but from memory, and memory once awakened does not sleep. Night falls softly over the reservations, not as an ending, but as a continuation. Campfires flicker in backyards, laughter rises between families, and somewhere out on the plains, the sky opens in a spray of stars so thick it looks like spilled salt. There's a rhythm in the stillness, a pulse beneath the quiet,
as if the land itself were dreaming of what it once was, and what it still might be. In the dreams of Native America,
the past and present walk side by side. The ancestors are not gone. They are simply folded into the world. They speak through the rustle of leaves, the rhythm of drums, the voices of children learning to pray again. And through those children, the future whispers back. There's a new kind of warrior now, one who fights not with weapons or words, but with creation. They paint, they dance, they write, they protest, they plant gardens in stolen soil. They carry the old codes of honor and balance into the modern world. And when asked what they're fighting for, they answer simply, a world where we don't have to fight. That answer says everything. Because the legacy of native warriors is not just about resistance, it's about transformation. The strength that once rode into battle now builds, protects, teaches, heals. The war drums have become heartbeats again, and that sound, steady and unstoppable, travels across generations. In New Mexico, a group of Navajo engineers designed solar panels shaped like traditional rugs. Technology inspired by heritage. In Canada, Cree women lead environmental movements, calling themselves the granddaughters of the water. In Oklahoma, a Choctaw linguist creates an AI that teaches her language to anyone willing to learn. Every act, scientific, artistic, spiritual, is a reclamation. The world is slowly realizing that what it calls innovation often has ancient roots. Sustainability, harmony, balance. These were indigenous ideas long before they became buzzwords. But for centuries, those ideas were ignored, mocked, or stolen. Now, they return not as demands, but as reminders. A Dakota storyteller once said, "The land remembers every kindness." And maybe that is the final lesson of the warrior. That true power is not in conquest or control, but in care. Still, not every story is gentle. Across the continent, communities continue to unearth graves, children buried behind residential schools, their names erased. Each discovery is a wound reopened, a truth that history refused to face. When those graves were found, people gathered in silence, wearing orange shirts that read, "Every child matters." Bells rang.
Candles burned. Elders wept. It was grief, yes.
But it was also truth. And truth, no matter how painful, is sacred. Because only when we face what was buried can we begin to breathe again. In that same year, a young Lakota singer wrote a song in memory of the lost children. It began with a single drum beat, slow, steady, echoing through the dark. And then her voice, trembling at first, rose like smoke. She sang in the language of her ancestors, words that meant, "Come home, we are still waiting." When the song ended, the crowd stood in silence. Not applause, not noise, just reverence. Moments like that are why the warrior's legacy endures. It reminds us that remembrance is not weakness, it's courage. For centuries, America told itself a myth. that its greatness was born from taming a wild frontier. But the truth is older, deeper, and quieter. This land was never empty.
It was alive, and it still is.
The warrior's story is not a chapter in the past. It is the pulse beneath the nation's skin. When a modern soldier of native descent returns from war, he carries not just medals, but memory. He stands at powwows beside elders, his uniform adorned with beadwork, his salute blending the military and the sacred. And when he dances, it's not just for pride, it's for the fallen, for those who never came home, for those who came home but were never seen. These ceremonies blur the line between now and then, between steel and feather, between uniform and regalia. They remind us that being a warrior is not about fighting for a nation, it's about fighting for meaning. One elder put it simply: war ends when we remember how to listen. Maybe that's what the ancestors have been whispering all along, that every battle,
Every injustice, every scar was leading here.
to this quiet place, to the chance to listen again. And when we do listen, truly listen, the noise of centuries fades, and all that remains is heartbeat and wind, because that's the sound of survival. When you stand on a hill at sunset, where prairie meets sky and everything glows in that last orange light, it's hard not to feel it, the weight and wonder of all who came before. The first hunters, the last dancers, the nameless and the famous. Their spirits are stitched into the soil. Their stories hum beneath the grass, and if you stay there long enough, the horizon stops looking like distance and starts looking like memory. You realize it's not the end of the world you're seeing. It's the edge of remembrance, the place where time folds back on itself and every warrior who ever lived is watching. They are not ghosts. They are guides, and their message, carried through centuries of silence, is clear. Do not forget. Do not despair. The fire still burns. The question is, will we tend it or let it fade again? The wind moves differently when it carries memory. It's heavier, slower, as though burdened by stories that refuse to die. Across the plains, through the canyons, over the black rivers that cut through the land, it carries whispers of warriors who have become part of the soil itself. And when that wind brushes against your skin, it doesn't feel like air.
It feels like touch.
Like someone, or something, reaching out from the depths of time to remind you that you're standing on sacred ground. That is the true inheritance of the native warrior. The land, not as property, not as resource, but as blood, as breath, as spirit. Every hill was once a lookout, every stream a sanctuary. Every shadow on the stone might still hold the outline of a life once lived in rhythm with the world. When settlers came, they brought fences. When the fences came, they cut through that rhythm, dividing what was meant to be whole, but the land, like memory, resists division. No matter how it's parceled, bought, or renamed, it never forgets who its first guardians were. Today, the warriors of that lineage return not with spears, but with maps, drones, and court documents. They argue in federal hearings for the return of their sacred sites: Bear Ears, Chaco Canyon, the Black Hills, places where stone and spirit intertwine. They stand before judges and congressmen, not to beg, but to remind. One elder once said, "We do not want your permission to prey on our land. We want our land so we can continue to pray." Those words hung in the courtroom like thunder. For a moment, even the law seemed to listen. This is what legacy looks like. Not glory, not wealth, but endurance.
Because survival is only half the story.
The other half is restoration. In California, tribes plant oak groves where logging stripped the mountains bare. In Alaska, Inuit hunters reclaim whaling grounds once closed by corporate greed. In Oklahoma, language schools grow from church basements and empty gymnasiums. The work is slow, quiet, and relentless. But so was erosion. So is healing. And through it all, the songs return. Not museum pieces, not curiosities, but living languages of the earth. Songs that mark seasons, celebrate hunts, honor the dead, call down rain. Songs that have outlasted empires. To outsiders, they may sound like echoes. To those who know, they are conversations between the living and the departed, between the people and the land. One night, during a ceremony in the Badlands, a young woman sang a warrior song that her great-grandfather once sang before battle. The melody rose high, trembling in the cold air. When it ended, she stood in silence for a long moment, then whispered, "He's here." And everyone around her nodded, because they all felt it too. Legacy isn't only what we leave behind, it's what we keep alive. The modern warrior carries that understanding with them, whether they're marching for clean water, teaching tribal history in a classroom, or running for office in Washington.
Their fight is not ancient, no.
Because the war for land, truth, and dignity never ended. It only changed its weapons. Faith, once tested by fire and exile, now becomes the compass. Power becomes responsibility. Fear becomes a teacher. Together they form a kind of wisdom that no institution can replicate. A young Mohawk lawyer once said, "We don't inherit the earth from our ancestors, we borrow it from our children." That line has been quoted in speeches and textbooks, but for her, it wasn't metaphor, it was instruction. It meant planting where her grandmother's house once stood. It meant teaching her daughter the songs that had nearly been silenced. It meant remembering that every generation of warriors owes the next one something better, and yet, even with progress, the ghosts remain. They linger in the places no one visits. Abandoned boarding schools, forgotten battlegrounds, fields that bloom over unmarked graves. Sometimes the wind catches just right, and it feels like you can hear them singing still. But those songs aren't sad. They are warnings, prayers, and sometimes laughter. Because even in suffering, the ancestors found humor. That sly, defiant humor that says, you can try to erase us, but we're still laughing. That, too, is part of the warrior's legacy. Laughter as rebellion. In the face of extinction, they smiled. In the face of conquest, they danced. To the colonizer's eye, it may have looked like defeat. To the earth, it was something else, a promise, a declaration that the spirit could not be conquered. And so now, when a young native child laughs freely, unashamed, unbroken, that sound is victory. Because every unbroken smile is an answer to centuries of erasure. The circle turns again. The drum continues. The land exhales. The wind carries another name. And the legacy lives master not in textbooks or monuments, but in the pulse of every living thing that remembers. When the rain falls on the plains, it does not ask permission. It falls where it chooses, the same way truth eventually does, returning always to the place it began. In the end, that is what all warriors fight for. Not dominance, not glory, but return. To bring the story back home. And as the first drops of rain strike the soil, darkening it with the scent of renewal, the world feels, just for a moment, whole again. There is a moment just before dawn when the world forgets to breathe. The stars fade, the horizon burns pale gold, and everything, the rivers, the trees, the empty roads, seems to wait. It's the hour between night and morning, past and future, silence and song. It's the hour the ancestors loved best. Because in that fragile light, the boundaries between worlds thin. The living can almost hear the dead. The earth hums.
The sky opens.
And if you listen closely, you can hear them. And the warriors, the singers, the mothers, the children, all whispering the same word. Remember, that word is not just a plea.
It's a commandment. Remember who you are.
Remember where you stand. Remember that every breath you take belongs not only to you, but to everything that came before. The forgotten lives of Native American warriors were never truly forgotten. They lived on, in story, in soil, in the rhythm of footsteps over sacred ground. They became the pulse beneath the nation's heart, a reminder that history is not a straight path, but a circle endlessly folding back on itself. Even now, that circle continues to turn. On a reservation in Montana, a group of veterans gathers for a sunrise ceremony. They stand shoulder to shoulder, young and old, men and women, dressed in a mix of camouflage, beadwork, and feathers. The drum begins. The sound rolls across the plains like thunder, steady and low. They pray not for war, but for peace. Not for victory, but for vision. And as the light rises, their shadows stretch long across the ground, connected, unbroken. Far away, in a city apartment, a young native filmmaker edits her new documentary. A story about her great-grandfather, a code talker from World War II. She's never met him, but his words guide her. "We spoke a language they tried to kill," he once said, "and it saved them all." She smiles as she adds that line to the film's closing scene, because she knows the circle is complete. And somewhere else, on a windy plain where grass grows tall over forgotten graves, a boy kneels to place wildflowers on the earth. He doesn't know the names of the warriors buried there, but he whispers anyway, "Thank you." The wind answers. It always does, because the story never ends. It only changes voices. History books may forget their names, but the land does not. The rivers still run where they once walked. The stars still burn where they once prayed. And the world, whether it knows it or not, still moves to their rhythm. The warrior's legacy is not carved in stone.
It's written in wind and heartbeat.
It's spoken in languages that outlast empire. It's carried by every generation that dares to listen. And if you close your eyes right now, wherever you are, you might hear it too. The faint echo of drums, the whisper of grass, the steady hum of endurance. They are not gone.
They never were.
They are the breath of the land. They are the laughter in the firelight. They are the guardians of memory, quiet, patient, eternal. And as long as someone still speaks their story, they will never fade, because the forgotten warriors of Native America did not die in vain.
They endured. They adapted.
They became the silence between thunder and rain, unseen, but always present. Long after the last empire falls, long after steel and stone crumble back into dust, their spirit will remain in every wind that sings, in every river that remembers, in every heart that refuses to forget, because history never sleeps. It only waits.